Hey, so this is the third part of Elements of Poker, the book review. We're going to just get into it. Just starting with the section about tournament poker, section 5. And Tommy goes a lot into talking about the bubble, the importance of it. Really, one of his kind of mindset things is obviously you have to be recognizing the bubble when it's coming. But really, Tommy's kind of advice here is to figure out your energy levels so that when the time the bubble starts approaching, you're still extremely fresh and that you are still feeling really good. The tournament time kind of conserving energy really is important here to play the bubble well, to make it through the bubble, to get into the money. Tommy talks a lot about that. Then he talks about stack size. He really thinks that stack size is sort of an overlooked thing. It seems maybe sort of obvious, but people just make a lot of blunders where they don't consider stack sizes, and there's different betting strategies and different reasons to play hands different ways. And the one thing that's true about tournament poker is, you're going to have 100 BBs, you're going to have like 10 BBs, and everywhere in between. And so with stack sizes always in fluctuation, that is kind of one of the novelties of tournament poker. So you really have to pay attention to stack sizes. We're not really going to cover it much because it didn't turn out to be too useful, but Tommy introduces some concepts like the dollar value of stack, and some other sort of related ideas to that, like the dollar value of your ability, or the dollar value of tilt and desire. It's just basically trying to put a framework around kind of what some of these things may be worth to you to play in certain spots. But Tommy is one to admit that it's not actually kind of that important. It was more important when he first wrote about it, and it doesn't really seem to hold much weight, as the game progressed. He talks about cash versus tournaments. This is definitely an interesting kind of discussion. I think basically a lot of people have exposure to both, and especially newer in their poker careers, people probably prefer tournament poker over cash poker. Tournament, you're looking at a bigger payday. If you're, a beginner, you're basically kind of like going to need a lot of luck and help anyway. So to be able to sit down and play a tournament, maybe there's some like cool pros at your table. You can sort of stretch the dollar value out a little bit more. So there's really kind of a lot of cool reasons to go into tournament poker if you're a beginner. Tommy basically says you should only play cash if you're a good quitter and a good game selector. You don't have those options in a tournament poker. And Tommy's obviously very big on being a good quitter and good game selector. And so that was kind of the brief overview of tournament poker. He talks about there are other elements in there like event odds, just kind of stuff that you really need to know what the buy-ins are, what the payouts are, the structure, everything like that you need to be aware of. So that was kind of a tournament poker. Tried to cover that succinctly as possible, and we'll move into Hold'em. So Hold'em is, again, he talks about positions, both pre-flop and post-flop. He talks about blinds. He talks about just how important it is to be acting last. And then he gets into his concept of the universal starting hands chart. And this is before we had sort of solvers to really kind of dictate what balanced ranges are. But the general idea was you would take your worst hand ever played from these different positions, and you'd kind of work in a chart and figure out, well, what's the worst hand that I'd ever play from this? And that would kind of be, your floor there for what you decide to do. And you can also mix in then to further refine your strategy and kind of find like a gray zone is you think about the worst hand ever played and the best hand ever folded. So somewhere between those and each positions, you're going to find some hands that are a little nebulous and maybe they're dependent on villains or stack sizes. There's a bit of a gray area. I guess today that would be some sort of frequency thing we would say instead of some sort of pure strategy. But Tommy takes a lot of time to go through the universal starting hands chart. It's something that's a good exercise for beginners or people who haven't really thought about ranges too much. The real value that Tommy says is this: if you really stick with a range that you're always folding and you're not continuing with, you're just going to be raising your C game level just so much better because you're just cutting out a lot of garbage that's going to get you into garbage situations. That's like, negative to zero kind of EV. And you're just going to be doing yourself a real favor by finding, these ways to cut out the crap from your range to really dial in range. You're having a reason to do things is really important. So I'll post a link to the universal starting hands chart on Tommy's website. That'll be in the notes if you want to kind of go through and do that exercise. It's something that's good to look at. He has it up on his website, and I think a little video to go along with it. So moving more into positions, he talks about just how important it is to really figure out a few situations. If you think about the poker that you play, full ring or shorthanded, for the most part, the people that are going to be in the hands are either the blinds or the button, right? The blinds already have some money in. The buttons are facing, the desire to act last. So if you're going to kind of, familiarize yourself and kind of really figure out how to play poker, a good place to start is just figure out your relationship and how you're going to play pots that involve situations where you're in the blind or you're playing against a blind, or, you have the button against the blinds, things like that. Because for the most part, their money is already in the pot for the blinds, and the buttons is trying to get in the pot. So most of these hands are going to involve these players. So that's just kind of be the most common occurrence. So the way you get better at poker is figuring out really common occurring spots and to just kind of study them and learn them better. So Tommy talks about that a bunch, which is, I thought, really, really helpful to understand. I mean, even today, you think about small blind versus big blind situations, like it's just so common and people blunder it all the time, but it's one of the most common situations that you're going to be in. So study up, basically, is Tommy's advice. Tommy really likes shorthanded. I do as well. The decisions are more consequential. There's more action. You're, still essentially playing close to the same percentages of, opens and such, but the ranges are going to be wider. There's going to be less EP. So if you are a shorthanded player, you're basically going to have to be a sharper poker player because ranges are going to be wider. All the decisions are a lot bigger, and things are, with wider combinations, there's just more sort of spots that are going to be tough to figure out, and you're going to have to navigate your way through these things. So that's really good to know, especially if you're new to poker. If you go and sit down at your local casino and somehow they're playing like 9 or 10 handed, you can knit it up a little bit more. You can play less hands, and that's good. But if you're in a shorthanded game, you're just forced into more action. So that was kind of a bit of what Tommy gets into in just talking about Hold'em. He talks about blinds a bit. He talked about blinds in part of the cash games too. He actually talks about blinds a lot, like in terms of posting and irregular blinds. I'm not going to cover much on that. You can kind of read the book for that. Moving on to limit Hold'em, which used to obviously be how poker was played. Poker used to be limit Hold'em in casinos, and that was what people wanted. Kind of the birth of no limit really happened. It's been around, but the real birth of it came through online poker, where once it was able to facilitate, capped buy-ins and offer a wide range of games that, people would play this online, and they'd go to their local casino and basically be like, hey, I want to play no limit. And so the game kind of was forced into casinos, but because there was such a demand for it, which is kind of wild, if you think about it. I remember growing up as a kid seeing like limit Hold'em being spread and played in like the Taj Casino in Atlantic City, and I remember rounders coming out, and I do remember like a sort of a change to then like seeing more no limit games being spread. And I'd played limit Hold'em once, I think, just for the fun of it, just to see. It was like 1-5 spread limit in Vegas or something like that, just to see what the game was all about. And you think about how generationally, everyone, what used to be a limit Hold'em player, and now pretty much everyone just plays no limit. and limit is for the most part kind of like dead unless it's in the mixed variety. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with limit poker being more solved at the upper levels too. People are less inclined to play a game that is more solved. One of the considerations that Tommy talks about is open limping versus open raising in limit hold'em, and really the only time you should ever open limp is if it's like sort of small pocket pairs, early position. If you're pretty certain that you're not going to be aggressively raised out of the pot, it's kind of player dependent. But for the most part, just like in hold'em, you should always be open raising because you want to get into your bread and butter situations, which is bread and butter is essentially where you have initiative and you're last to act. It's the same thing in like no limit as it is limit, and it kind of goes back to the topic that we just talked about in the last section of like having a blind playing against, or the button playing against the blind. So you really want to know what your bread and butter situations are. You want to figure out how to get into them when raising is appropriate. You want to figure out when you're in them against someone else and play more cautiously. But learning these positions where you're essentially late position with initiative, if you look at any sort of database, you're always just making more money in those spots. So you want to get into bread and butter situations. I think, all of this was incredibly important at the time in casinos and limit where people probably weren't as aggressively trying to get into these spots, but it's really good to know, like, where is your bread and butter? Where is it coming from? So nowadays that would be something that's, it's kind of obvious. We just talked about it, but yeah, studying your database and figuring out where you're crushing and kind of getting into those, your best late position spots and how to minimize when you're in somebody else's bread and butter. It's definitely pertinent for limit hold'em to have enough chips in front of you. So Tommy goes into when it's appropriate to be buying in and rebuying, and just so you always have a rack, so you can always be capping out action if you need to on the big hands. With no limit, you can like top up and you can figure out when to rebuy, sort of given certain action. To cover certain people if you want, everything like that. But it's definitely extremely important in limit as well to always have your racks ahead of you, your weapons of war. Moving on, Tommy talks about different hand classings, hand groups, and you have your like group A, your group B and C and D, and kind of the dividing is actually from your group A to your next group is King Queen. He thinks King Queen is such a specific type of hand that it's really important to understand that is a divider, how to play it, the hands that are better than that and the hands that are worse than that. I'm not going to go too much more into the hand groupings, but you should have certainly different tiers of hands in your own mind. And I think considering King Queen is kind of like I think a lot of people, King Queen, King Jack, especially of the offsuit variety, people can play them a little bit differently, and it's like a little nebulous sometimes. How do you play it? Like, am I getting dominated or am I dominating someone else? So yeah, that's basically what Tommy talks about in the limit hold'em. And the final section is a long one. It was about the elements of performance, and this is really kind of a cool area where Tommy gets more into like mental strategies, things that you can do that really help out, and just kind of being aware of what the game is and building healthy routines around it and things that you're going to face. And he talks about resistance and bad resistance being opposing what is in reality a fact. Sometimes we're presented with things and they're true, and we just do everything we can to resist and avoid that, and that causes pain. And the more we resist these large things, the more pain it can cost. And so Tommy talks about just sort of being very aware of that, and recognizing that poker can fuel like this pain and these challenges, but there are paths of sort of leak resistance where you start plugging your leaks and you can start reducing this pain. Tommy's huge, obviously, into pain reduction, and a lot of that comes into some tips that we'll talk about, which are like awareness. I'm sure we've all been there where we're playing and, we just start getting into it and we kind of lose awareness, and then we come up for like a breath of air. It's some 10, 20, 30 minutes later, and like, wow, we just played a lot of hands, and, how cognizant of it are we? How aware of what was happening were we? And how aware of our awareness were we? And Tommy goes through some sort of exercises of checking in with our awareness, our consciousness, and what it means to kind of just be tapping into ourselves to make sure that we're playing with awareness. And I think that's really important. It's definitely important because, yeah, you just sort of go into those poker dazes. I'm sure we've all been there sometimes. And, it's just sometimes we're just splashing and it becomes like autopilot or not really thinking. And we really need to keep our awareness at all times. Tommy talks about poker funk and table funk, and just kind of some ways that we can be in a funk at the table or after big losses, and it's going to be a natural human tendency. What we can do, we can just like quit sometimes. We can walk away. We can find ways to be positive, or just do kind of like some different things to distract us out of our funk. We can always certainly just kind of like call it quits and go to bed if it's really bad. But being in a funk is definitely going to happen. And, it's just a part of the game we have to be aware of. So Tommy talks about discipline and tiltlessness. I think those are some pretty cool elements. Talking about like sort of daily discipline practices. But the real, I think, huge part of elements of performance, and I think, Tommy would say this to this day, and I think a lot of people are aware of it too, is breathing. And just how important breath work is. Kind of even as I go through these slides right now, was I super aware of my breath, or was it kind of something that I just check in with every once in a while? When you're playing, are you aware of your breath? Are you calm and in control? Are you doing these things? It's so important to just kind of be into our breath. Tommy puts it like this, is that our mind and our thoughts are going to be in so much pain. They're going to cause and create pain. It's almost like a Buddhist sort of belief of just like these thoughts in existence can create pain. And so one way to combat that is to just breathe deeply. Put that focus on breathing through control or counting or following our breath or observing it, are the different strategies. And by doing that, it calms our body naturally, which then calms our mind down, which is great. We can operate better with better presence once we start mastering our breath work and breathing appropriately. And it really calms our mind down. It just really keeps us in place. And so that is just part of like the wellness of poker and the wellness at the table. All of these elements of performance, there's definitely a bit more of them, were really important. I think it's really kind of illuminating how much of poker is not just the math and your intuition, but the things that you can do on and off the table to enhance your performance. And that was the conclusion to Elements of Poker. So thanks for following along with this, and I'm going to wrap it up.